Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene our third of 5 sessions in a program on Compassion 2.0. Over the last several days, as we've been contemplating compassion in our time, I've been making the point that compassion has a very specific meaning in a time of extremis. In normal times, normal definitions apply to our life and our interactions with each other. But when we're in a time of deep contradictions, when the center no longer holds, when stresses are escalating in every domain of life, and when our governments are no longer capable of ensuring the normalcy that is their mandate, the virtues and the vices that characterize human attitudes and behavior begin to shapeshift. And this week, we've been contemplating love, contemplating compassion 2.0. And so I've been very deeply meditating on what does love mean in a time of extremis? What does love mean in a time of genocide? What does love mean in a time of escalating climactic and ecological turbulence? What does love mean when there is more war than there is peace? And our lives are being shattered by not only the pace, but the direction of change itself. As I was contemplating yesterday, I was drawn to the 4 quartets of T.S. Eliot, one of the most extraordinary poets of modern times. And in the 4 quartets toward the end, he has an extraordinary passage that many of you may be familiar with. It's very famous. But he talks about the doves descending, break the air with flame of incandescent terror, of which the tongues declare the one discharge from sin and error. Our only hope, or else despair, lies in pyre or pyre, to be redeemed from fire, by fire. And then he asks the seminal question, who then devised this torment? Love. Love is the unfamiliar name behind the hands that wove the unbearable shirt of flame. We only live, only suspire to be consumed by fire or fire. I don't know of any passage in world literature that more deeply encapsulates love in a time of extremis, compassion in a time of such contradictions that our world is being rent apart, and none of us can hold it together. And the centrifugal forces of chaos beset us at every level, both internal and external. And to be able to identify love as the unfamiliar name behind the hands that are weaving this shirt of flame and to come into a realization that we're only redeemed from fire, by fire, opens up a pathway of illumination that I find deeply challenging, but also deeply inviting, and in a certain way, profoundly comforting. Because ordinarily, we put compassion and love in a certain beatific vision of the world. And we consider the realities of genocide in Gaza, for example, as somewhere where love is not, and where hatred prevails, and where strife supersedes compassion. But bringing those contradictions together, I think, is what Carl Jung would describe as the crucifixion of the ego, because we can't hold those together intellectually. You can only hold those contradictions together in your heart. The heart is the only place in our human beingness that is elastic enough that when the mind shuts down because it no longer understands, as Rene Pascal said, when the logic of the mind ends, the logic of the heart begins. And it's in that cauldron where the heart understands the deepest workings of love. And I'd make just two very quick points for our considerations. I think one of the consequences of holding what Eliot is inviting us to consider about compassion, about love, which aren't exactly the same, but are essentially synonymous, is that one collapses time from thinking one has time to an immediacy of what Martin Luther King called the fierce urgency of now. And in that fierce urgency of now, we understand that because we no longer have time, our choices matter absolutely, as opposed to relatively. That's the fierce urgency of now that I think comes out of understanding love as the unfamiliar name behind the hands that weave the unbearable shirt of flame. And the second point, I think, for me, that is germane and leads into the discussion today, is that in the fierce urgency of now, compassion and love and existential reality is no longer an abstraction. And that's why the mind can no longer be the operative principle. It has to be embodied. Love has to be in every cell of who we are. It has to be profoundly somatic, profoundly psychosomatic. It needs to encompass us in every bit of who we are, because the fierce urgency of now compresses the contradictions literally inside our bodies. And that's why when we love, it affects our bodies, as we shall see today. but it affects our bodies the most profoundly when we're holding the contradictions inside our hearts. And that is what catalyzes our capacities to be redeemed from fire, by fire, in the extraordinary understanding that this is the work of love. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today on Humanity Rising. And now it's my great pleasure to turn it over to my very good friend and colleague, Tom Eddington and Carson Kelly. Tom, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Never knowing in advance what you're going to share. There are days when I'm, struggling to create a bridge from your opening comments to the dialogue. And today, as often is the case, I'm left speechless. There's not a need to build a bridge from your opening comments to the broadcast. And there are days like today when I'm just immensely grateful for you being in my life and
Thank you.
the opportunity to flourish in your wisdom. So thank you for the opening comments. What I would share is that the invitation for all of us is to show up fully integrated. Our skull, brain, our heart, our intuitive body, our mind, body, and spirit, and that's the invitation that I'm left with your opening comments of showing up as a fully integrated human being. And so thank you for that. And I'll welcome my good friend Carson Kelly to join. And for those of you who have been watching today or haven't had a chance to meet Carson before from prior broadcasts that we've done together, Carson is the founder of Compassion 2.0, has been doing some remarkable work around neurology and brain science and consciousness and compassion and flourishing and so much more. And great to be with you again today, Carson. And thank you for helping put together this extraordinary week. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. And I'll just say to everything you said about Jim's intro is just simply ditto. I mean, just tremendous. I too, it's just like, it's funny because the podcast or the broadcast is starting and I'm excited to, talk. And at the same time, it's like, keep going, Jim. I want to just keep going, So it's quite enjoyable. So thank you, Jim. And again, thank you, Tom. And I'd also like to thank Jim outside of his profound wisdom and insight, to Jim and to the team at Humanity Rising for the opportunity to come onto the broadcast and to share the work of the Extended Compassion 2.0 community. Do really appreciate this very much. And also to showcase the amazing work that this extended community and Compassion 2.0 is doing. Also, again, to thank you, Tom, for introducing me to this opportunity and for doing this work together. Enjoy it quite a bit. As Tom said, my name is Carson Kelly, and I'm the founder of Compassion 2.0. For those of you that don't know Compassion 2.0, it's a collection of professionals who are attempting to scale compassion through the intentional architecture of compassionate human experience that is both based on scientifically validated practices and interventions, and also one that can be measured. We do this through the creation of compassionate and flourishing frameworks through both product development and organizational culture architecture. A community consists of many different folks: product developers, neuroscientists, behavioral scientists, people professionals, product designers, entrepreneurs, VCs, and more. And you can learn more about us at compassion2.com. So this week, as Jim mentioned, we're continuing our book club exploration, and I'd like to invite on a woman, Catherine Schweikert. I think I said that, Schweikert. We were talking about this earlier in the green room, the German versus the US presentation. So Catherine and I have known each other now, I don't know, maybe 6 months, something like that. And she's the author of an incredible book called The Compassionate Remedy. And we're going to talk about that and dive in. So welcome, Catherine. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Carson. And I have to agree with Tom and you, Carson, about Jim's opening. I was riveted and I was so excited when you were talking about what we do when the world falls apart. And the first thing I thought was, well, the world was never together. And so when we start recognizing that the world is what it is by nature, chaotic, the one thing we can do is to embody compassion and come together as humans.
Absolutely.
And that was what struck me. And I just thought, wow, what a great way to wake up. I want, Jim, I want you to be in my world every morning to give me just a little bit to get my day started. It was lovely.
Well, as we dive in, I mean, to your point, particularly to Jim's point around the somatic nature of embodiment of compassion, a whole bunch of different things. Before we dive there, which I know we will, tell the audience a little bit just about yourself and your background and, what led you to writing this book.
Okay, well, I've been practicing medicine as a PA for 23 years. And it's been a delight. It's been an honor and a privilege, and it's also been utterly frustrating, heartbreaking, and infuriating.
Mhm.
And so I think that, that coupled with just me being human and having a human life and having all of that happening too, combined, really created this frustration and anger within me where I thought, it's just not worth it anymore. We're not connecting. The system isn't set up for it. I don't know how to remedy this. And
Sure.
I started feeling a pretty big lack of compassion for myself primarily and for others secondarily. And I really got curious about that because that wasn't how I was born. And I recognized a change in myself. And so that curiosity led me to start, studying, and I signed Karen Armstrong's um the compact that she started back, I think it's been almost 20 years ago now, but um and from then I just became more curious over time and started thinking, well, what is this quality that's converting from this very peaceful, loving, kind experience to more of a frustration. And the more I looked into it, I got really curious because I started seeing that this actually is something that we need to embody because it affects our body physiologically. And then that's where my head just exploded. And that's where the book came from, was me recognizing, holy goodness, this actually is something that we need for our health and for the health of others. Mhm.
So tell us just a little bit more, just to dig a bit further. What
Yeah.
was your day-to-day experience like as a physician's assistant in that experience? Like what, you're going about what it is that you're supposed to be doing, you're supporting people, you're helping people. What did you experience? What was the encounter that generated the frustration and the concern?
Well, it was first I think the first most frustrating thing for me was the schedule. I know that this sounds very basic, but it was truly the schedule. How I had, a 15-minute slot to see somebody that turned into a 10-minute slot to see somebody. And and then I would work as a coach as well for clinicians in the hospital to teach them how to connect rapidly so that we could get everything in that period of time. And what ended up happening was my frustration of not being able to stay with the patient was just as great as the patient's frustration of not being able to have me in the room with them to actually see what was happening and going on with, the issue that they came in with. And so it felt like first I was rushed, and then from rushed, I became frustrated because there were people who I couldn't figure out in that 10-minute thing that I had. And I wouldn't even call it a visit because it was like you were just shoved in a room together And that 10 minutes turned into 5 minutes because the person who had to room them took up too much time. I mean, it was just this time thing where I was trying to make stretch time that, and it was near impossible. And then, you know, the system itself wasn't really set up. It's like, in order for compassion to arise, the conditions have to be right, you know, and the conditions were not set up for compassion to arise naturally because we're all compassionate, but we need the conditions for it to rise up, and the conditions were not there. And the interactions were less than satisfying for the patients. The patients know that. And when those connections are not satisfying, that does something to the patient's health as well, because we have research showing that when patients feel connected to their care providers, they actually do better. They follow the instructions, they heal better internally on their own because they feel connected. They feel like they've been heard. They feel like they've been seen, and that they trust the person that they're getting this sage advice from, right? And it's it was sorely lacking. And so I could feel it, and the patients can feel it. And their frustration started to grow, and their complaints started to grow. And it just feels like this cycle of, you know, you are on in a hamster wheel, just going and going and going and going, and never really being able to experience the thing that brought most of us to medicine, which is to serve our fellow human beings. You know,
Mhm.
it wasn't to get enemy, you know, a bunch of RVUs and make a bunch of money. It was never about that. It was really about helping other people and, you know, being a part of the health of the world. And we started becoming part of the sick care instead of the health care. And we forgot what it meant to truly be a trusted friend and ally of our patients. And then we became part of the business. RVUs are just a way of measuring how many people you see and how many points you get for the person that you see. Somebody asked in the
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, thank you for clarifying.
yeah.
How, not to how to say this, talk about bigger and more substantive things, but out of curiosity, of your colleagues, physicians, assistants, nurses, I don't know all the different
Yeah.
titles, but of
Yeah.
all the crew in the space trying to help humans,
Yeah.
what percentage in your mind, anecdotally or formally, do you think people share your opinion?
Oh, I would say there's a great majority, especially since I've come out of my compassion closet. That's what I call it. I'm finding so many other people. They're like, thank you for saying it. So
Mhm,
percentage-wise, I would say a good 90%.
mhm.
I mean,
That's
it's
what I
the
would think.
majority for sure. And the other 10% are, I believe, are just still in the closet. They're still
Yeah.
compassionate closeted, and that's okay. They'll come out. We'll make it safer.
Yeah, interesting. And so it sounds just extraordinarily transactional at this point. It sounds
Right.
that the whole system is to, as you said, go from sick care. I'm sorry, from, well, inversely, but it is now sick care as opposed to health care.
Right. Right. And then the bigger question is who's sick?
Right.
What's sick? Because I can tell you from my perspective, my health suffered when I was living from a less compassionate place. And when I brought less compassion in with my patients, I was miserable too.
Unpack that a little bit. Why do you think, I mean, I believe you for sure. It makes perfect sense, but what is the nuance behind that? Why do you think that's going on? Do you feel like you're stymied in your ability to offer care? I mean, obvious, that's
Absolutely.
kind of obvious, of course, but what does that mean more subtly, I guess?
Yeah. Well, you know, when your intention is to help another human being, but you can't get past your own frustrations in order to do it, it just leads to this impossible feeling of frustration of
Mm.
then you internalize it and it becomes I'm not effective and there's something wrong with me. Why do I even show up? I don't even care anymore,
Right.
and you get this internal, switch, because when, I don't know about you guys, but when I'm up against something impossible, one of my responses to that is, screw it, I can't do this.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And so, some people say, well, that's burnout. And I'm like, is it? It's just kind of giving up. And it's just kind of acquiescing to what's present. And I don't know if that's exactly burnt out, but I can tell you that those feelings of giving up and acquiescing when you still love something, that could lead to burnout, because you're putting all this energy into suppressing your goodness.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
when your goodness shows up, it's not appreciated because you're taking too long, or you're being too you're connecting too much with your patients. You're getting too close to them, and you're experiencing what they're experiencing even for a moment. It's like, no, don't do that. Remain objective. And it's like, ah, geez, being objective, I think, requires us to connect. How else are we going to be objective and really understand what somebody's going through unless we connect?
This is so many fascinating things, and I know Tom probably has things to ask, but just to follow up on two threads here for a moment. First off, I didn't really put it together around the somatic experience of the caregivers
Mhm.
experiencing a frustrating environment. So you have, some sort of medical business entity that's
Mhm.
that's paying people to help people and care for people, and yet the entity is doing it presumably from a framework of money and
Mhm.
metrics and so forth, things that businesses need at one level to operate. But in so doing, they create this stymied environment where, of course, the patients or the people that are there to receive the care are experiencing. I mean, I experience it. But I didn't really think about the concept of the embodied frustration of going as a caregiver to going into a physical space and engaging with people with the intention to deeply help and support, and then just be shut down because the clock just ticked past a certain number, or there's not enough in their insurance program, or whatever it is. I don't know the specifics, but to be stymied and how that must physically feel, and then to come home and how that would build up over time. So I'm really appreciating that perspective and learning something here. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Does that sound about right? I mean, I would
Oh,
imagine
yeah,
you
no,
probably carry that tension.
I'm actually like, my chest is getting tight. It's like
All
you're
right.
describing it. I'm like, yes, that's how it
Yeah.
feels.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you're not
Oh,
in that space right now. Right now, you're in a
no.
beautiful space behind
Yeah,
you. And
I
so,
am. Oh,
so
I
you
am.
know,
Yes. No,
experience
but
that more.
it is
Um,
absolutely true.
the other thing that came up too, and this is something my colleague, in a previous entity I was involved with, Dr. Tanya Singer, would talk about empathic distress. And this is a challenging thing for me to at least understand, and particularly because I'm not a caregiver in that way professionally, as you were. How do you balance that? So we wave a magic wand right now with the three of us, and we fix all of the medical facilities in the entire world, and it's perfect, just the way that we as benevolent dictators think that it should be. And all of a sudden, you're rolling in to one of those spaces to help somebody, and there are the very real needs of, say, some number of people that are requesting support, and there is a certain amount of time between the time the sun rises and it sets. We get tired because you can't do these things 24/7. You have to eat and sleep and rest yourself.
Right.
So based on those realities, there is a certain amount of people that you can support in a given time period. And over days, 5 days, and next week, and then over months and years and so on, lots of different faces would be presented to a caregiver to engage and to support.
Right.
How in our benevolently decided world, in the medical world, how would caregivers be able to both connect deeply as human to human, and at the same time not necessarily carry with them the suffering or the pain of all of these humans that they're experiencing without turning them into an object, without turning them into, a
Right.
series of symptoms and cures and so forth. I'm not sure if I'm being articulate here, but can you speak to that and help me to understand how that might look?
I love that. It's really a beautiful question, actually. Well, the thing that I like to explain to people about compassion, there's a couple of things, is I've never taught one human being to be compassionate, period, because everybody already is. And so, and like I said earlier, creating the conditions for that compassion to arise is important. And that empathetic hit that people get in a compassionate response, because you have to recognize that somebody's suffering, which is pretty easy in a medical setting because they're coming to you with a complaint. There's some suffering going on, right? So you have to be able to recognize it. Then you have to have the humility to say to yourself, I am no better or no worse than this human in front of me. There is no hierarchy of I am here, you're there. So you're at a level playing field to begin with. And then once you see that they're suffering, you do feel it. You feel it. You go, oh, gosh, they really are suffering. And here's where the rubber meets the road. It's like you take that emotion, that empathetic hit, those when the pain centers in your brain light up because you're feeling it, and you've got that oxytocin flowing through your body because you're connecting, right? Then you turn that into an action.
Right.
And that's where you can change from being overwhelmed to being in the reward centers in your brain, to being where you stay connected, but you're doing something proactively to alleviate the suffering of the person in front of you. And sometimes that action is simply listening or being present for their suffering. Because a lot of times, I don't know about you, but when I've suffered, sometimes it feels very lonely in that suffering. And you can feel quite alone. And just having another human being witness you and acknowledge it is extraordinarily rewarding. And to know that you've done that for another human being, being a human being ourselves, because sometimes what happens is we forget our own humanity and what it's like to suffer when you get into that other position. But I think that is how we can make it sustainable, is recognizing it for what it is, the alleviation of suffering without creating more suffering. So then you have to be, as a practitioner of sorts, clinician, physician, aware of what you're feeling. You have to have an internal practice and an internal awareness. And this is something that isn't in the training. To say, hey, they say, physician, heal thyself, but it's more than that. It's physician, be aware of thyself. And so then when you have to, and it takes all but 30 seconds to recognize, oh, wow, you know what? I got a little too deep into what was going on here, and I forgot that I'm here for compassion. I'm here to alleviate suffering, not create more. How do I alleviate suffering now? Get that frontal lobe engaged and say, hey, because whatever, the problem is going to be different for each and every person that's in front of you. This would alleviate the suffering in this case. Let me get on that. And once you start doing that, your nervous system regulates, your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. That vagus nerve kicks in and says, oh yeah, you can breathe deeply now. You can calm down. Everything's all right. We've got a plan. And when your brain says we've got a plan, it calms down. And that self-regulatory mechanism just starts coming in. It's super simple, but it isn't easy. So
Yeah,
that's it. It takes practice over and over and over again.
yeah, thank you. I can keep going. I'm going to pause and pass it to my friend Tom. Tom, I imagine you probably have some things you'd like to jump in with.
Yeah, just real quickly, just a little bit more about your background. So as I was doing my research in preparation for today, I saw that you were a graduate of the CCARE program, the Center
Yes.
for Compassion, Altruism Research and Education at Stanford.
Yeah.
I'm a graduate of that program as well. And
Oh,
one of the things that I experienced when I was going through the program was the incredible number of fellow students who were in the healthcare industry, the doctors, nurses, physicians
wonderful.
assistants, lab technicians, et cetera, who were
Yeah.
going through the program. And they were all what I'll call refugees of the illness profit system that we call our healthcare system in America. And I'm wondering what other training, what other things have you found to be helpful in staying compassionate, to understand compassion, to bring it to your work and for your writing of the book?
Oh, sorry, it broke up for a minute. In my
Oh,
work and my
yeah, I was wondering what other training, what other resources you found valuable
okay,
as you
great.
prepared, for not only for writing the book, but also in your daily life and your work.
Right. So the other thing I did was the 8-week course there that was at Stanford, the heart-centered compassion course, which was very helpful. Um, I decided, I mean, personally, I decided I was going to get a PhD and study compassion and how it affects our physiology. So there were many different things that I looked at during that time. But my daily practice, now that I've completed the PhD and I'm done with the CCARE program and I'm delivering these programs to hospitals and other venues throughout my world, um, is really practicing being present with who I am. And I know that that sounds very simple, but it is one of the most difficult things I've ever done in my life, is just truly, like, when I get up in the morning saying, okay, which Catherine is showing up today? Who am I today? And how's it going to work out for you today? And so it means recognizing how I feel in my body. So every day I wake up, I'm like, how does my body feel? Does it feel healthy? Does it need rest? What does my body need today? Does it need to go slower or faster? And taking that to the next step and saying, okay, how am I breathing? You know, how am I breathing shallow? I mean, it's really based in my body because this is something I want to embody. So I got to figure out how the body's doing first. And the second thing I do is I start interacting with people around me and I pay attention to how I'm treating my husband, how I'm treating my son. It really starts at home. Even this morning, embarrassingly, I was like, okay, I've got this thing I've got to do, you guys. Now, please be quiet because I don't want the dogs barking. And my son's birthday was yesterday, so we have 6 teenage boys outside in my house. I'm like, "You guys be quiet," and I was kind of snapping, and then I was just like, "Are you kidding me? This is so ironic. I'm gonna be going on to this program where we're gonna talk about compassion, and I'm showing 0 compassion for all these lovely men in my house, right?" And so I had to kind of slow down and say, "Whoa." And so it's really about coming back to yourself over and over again, and not um in a narcissistic, like it's all about me way, but it truly is all about you because you're the one that's showing up in your life, right? And so kind of finding that out. The second thing is doing a lot of work on what triggers you? Because I think that this is a really important thing and David Rico does some great work on recognizing triggers and what triggers are. And I do mention some of that in my book as well. And I think it's in the compassion in the brain chapter, if I'm not mistaken. And what's really interesting is we don't often realize when we're being triggered. And so, and quickly, the easiest way to recognize it is when you have a very big response to something that may not be very big at all. And you feel it physiologically and you can't let go of it, and you perseverate about something. That's when you know you have a trigger. And the important thing about the trigger is finding out, how do you unblock that? So removing the blocks that create the conditions for compassion to arise. And so I'm always on the lookout for when I'm blocked. And somebody asked me, well, how do you know you're blocked? And I said, well, I just think about the last time I acted like an asshole, you know? And, and, and then I'm like, there must be a block there. And they'll say, how do you know when somebody else is blocked? And I'm like, well, same goes true. You know, when was the last time they were kind of being an asshole? They're probably blocked right then. So have some compassion for their state of blocked, and see what you can do to help them see that block, heal that block, and be there with them the same way that you would for yourself. Does that answer it?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And
Yeah.
one of my takeaways is I'll use some of the language you used, body-based being,
Yeah.
and just that sense of how am I being? How is my body, and being based in my body? How is my body being? How are other people experiencing me?
Right, right. Because we are energetic beings, and when we're chaotic, that chaos resonates out from us. And it's really hard to create compassion in chaos. You can have compassion for the chaos and for the experience of chaos, but it's really hard to create a lot of compassion for yourself and others when you're in that state. It's like, first you have to recognize the state and go, wow, I'm really chaotic. And then you can start from there, and little bits of compassion start coming up through that recognition of your own struggle and your own suffering. And it's so beautiful the way that it happens, because it's effortless. It just, once you say, oof, I'm suffering, all of a sudden compassion's like, I got you, girl, or I got you, man. Right?
I like the distinction you're making there between the state, whether it's yours or somebody else's, and the person,
Right.
and creating that separation between the state and the person opens or creates an opening for compassion.
Yeah, because I look at us like we are eternal, and these states of being pass by. They flow through us, but they are not us. They don't define us. They can become habitual and characters of us, but at any time those things can change.
I think the other question that's up for me is, knowing that I'll call it the system, the illness profit system that we call healthcare.
Yes.
It's where it's where you work. Um, how do you prepare yourself to go into that environment every day, and how do you support others who are in this system that's oppressive, that isn't human-centered, it's not
Right.
patient-centered, and how do you personally support yourself, and how do you support others in trying to show up and retain that sense of humanity in a system that is counter to being human?
Right. Okay, so some of it's very basic. Every time I show up to work, I bring flowers. Every single time. And well, as long as they're still living, I won't bring more. But when I come, I bring flowers. I bring some for the front office, for the back office, and often for the office that we are working in as clinicians. Just as a reminder that there's beauty, because sometimes we forget. The second thing I do, and these are environmental things, like I work from the outside in when it comes to this. I make sure there's good lighting and good music. And I know that sounds silly, okay? But let me tell you, when you're having a bad day, there's a whole lot of things good lighting, some flowers, and music can do for you, okay? And then when I come to work, I create relationships with my colleagues so that they know that they're safe to talk to me about anything, anything. Like we talk the gamut in my colleagues, my group. We'll talk about the patients of how, like, what's, hey, I got this interesting case. Can you, let's brainstorm what's going on here. Those conversations happen all the time. But it's also conversations like, hey, how's your daughter? How are things? How's your mom? I know your mom's been sick. It's really using the same connections that you would with your patients, with your colleagues, because we're no different. We're all human. And making those connections with each other and being present for our suffering as well is essential, to have those connections with each other, because we all need a safe place to go and we need to be each other's safe places, period. And so it's important and imperative that I create that environment wherever I work. And if I cannot create that environment, I am in the wrong place and I will continue to search. However, I've been with Sutter for 23 years, so I think I'm in the right place. But that is one of the things that, or one of the many things that happen for me in my actual workplace that I do to kind of just creating the conditions so that if there is some compassion that's accessible, it can make it through the cracks of all of the other stuff. Because, we always call it our urgent care bubble. We work in this bubble where we feel unaffected by the system for a time being. Because what we do is we kind of just, say, yep, this is the system, but we are not the system. And we have personal power and agency over how we treat each other, how we treat our patients. And guess what? You're probably going to wait longer, but you're going to get the best of us when you do. And so if I could do anything, I could make a public service announcement that wait times are that time that glory and compassion are being built. Because the longer you wait, maybe has something to do with the fact that there's this clinician back there that is bucking the system and saying, I'm not going to spend 5 minutes with you. I'm going to give you the time that you need, and it's going to mess up our day. It's going to mess up our schedule, but it isn't going to mess up our connection, and it isn't going to mess up your capacity to heal. So
So profound. Just if I can just jump in, Tom, just briefly. What I'm hearing you say repeatedly and very elegantly is reclaiming our humanity regardless of the role within this system. So the roles of, and I love that too. What did you call it, Tom? The illness profit system, or the illness profit system, which
illness profit system.
It's tremendously on point. Because by living in that frame, any systemic frame, and I'm sure it's not just applicable to the healthcare system that you're participating in, Catherine, but just anywhere, wherever there are systems broadly. It's this notion of this reclamation of, and I love that, flowers, music, and lighting, and building relationship. That's so great. It's just such a great intentionality to say, I'm not just going to plug into this role that this illness profit system in this case has designed for me to do. I'm going to step back. I'm going to maintain my center within my heart or within my biome or wherever that actually might physiologically be. And from that place, I orient towards others who I hope are doing the same thing, essentially. And then together we can achieve the larger goal, regardless of what these rules and frames of metrics and operations and so forth want us to be doing. Is that about right?
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And some
Very
people,
cool.
like when we get the new residents in, I feel like some of them are a little confused because I'm like, hey, how's it going for you today? The lighting, we have only lamps, no overhead fluorescence in our office. And there's this music going, which I usually do lo-fi. I don't know if you guys are familiar with lo-fi. Yeah. So it's
Lo-fi
just real
beats. Yeah, it's great.
chill. It's
Yeah.
just like we float into the
Background, just a
room.
mellow, just,
Not-
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's really
and I'm
great.
just
Yeah.
like, and I'm like, and I always ask the people I work with, hey, is there any kind of music that just does it for you? Let's switch it to that. And really just make the place someplace where you can flourish, right? Where
Yeah.
you create the conditions for compassion and flourishing and really being present and really doing what we intended to do when we all signed up for this shtick of practicing medicine, right?
Yeah, it's beautiful. And on top of that, just to continue to add, um, it's even thinking about lo-fi beats as an example, which to your point are just very relaxed. There's just kind of a background, just kind of a movement forward. It's pleasant. And I would be very curious to understand what the neuroscience is of, say, lo-fi beats, or the
Oh,
energetics
yeah.
of what the resonance is as a result of
Yeah.
taking in the lighting, taking in and having these neurobiological or these physical inputs, and
Right.
how it's starting to impact the neurobiological frame, or I'm not sure of my words here, or psychophysiological, which I think is, something that I saw in your book.
Yeah.
How that shows up and then emanates from the caregiver, which is what you're speaking to
Right.
in this example. I wonder what the science is behind all of that. And I'm sure it's tangible.
Yeah,
I
I bet it
don't know if
is.
anybody's
Measure
checked it out.
functional MRIs and lo-fi.
Yeah,
Somebody did
exactly.
that study,
Or,
right?
heavy metal, whatever, is that,
Right, right. Oh
but as
God.
long as it,
Right,
creates that space of, um, of practice that,
right,
because then again, to your point, then the other side, the care recipient, it's all around these physiological field, these energetic fields. And I know,
right.
Tom has a fair amount of study in that, so he might be much more eloquently about that. But it's fascinating. It's really very cool. I had some other questions too, Tom, unless you have some more things that you wanted to jump in on.
It's not a question so much as a comment. You mentioned earlier the cracks, Catherine, and for
Yeah.
me, I love what you're doing, and that as the saying goes, the cracks are where the light comes in.
Yes.
And you've got this system you're operating in, and you're finding those cracks to bring in the music, to bring in the lighting, to bring in the relationships and the personal connections. And it's a beautiful way of thinking about how to work within the system to change the system,
Yeah.
Right,
and to deliver compassion, to be able to actually
right,
foster healing in a
right,
system that's not designed to support healing. And I
right.
just that just metaphorically, that using those cracks in the system for the light to come in, the
Mm-hmm.
compassion to come in.
Yeah. No,
It makes me think too of just to all of what the inverse of this is, for people who are in very difficult situations, let alone say Gaza. Not to dive into that, but just hearing these stories about these hospitals that are being bombed, and just the immense challenge, and just again, the pain there, and just how incredibly different, to put it mildly, that experience is.
right.
I did have some more questions around the psychophysio. What's the phrase? The
Psychophysiological.
psychophysiological, yeah, benefits. Could you unpack that a little bit for us in terms of the
Yeah.
science and what's going on in the body? You've been speaking to it throughout the course of this conversation, but curious to know if you could just get very explicit and just unpack
Okay.
what your visions are and the science behind it.
Okay. Well, I did some research. So, in my research, I did how cortisol levels, long-term cortisol levels measured through hair, and heart rate variability, how these two things were affected or correlated with levels of compassion, self-compassion, and fear of compassion, because fear of compassion is really kind of what I really like looking at these days. It's just, I start going down compassion rabbit holes. And what I found was that those who had higher levels of compassion and self-compassion had better heart rate variability. And those who had higher fears of compassion had lower heart rate variability. And these long-term cortisol levels in those folks who had higher levels of fears of compassion were higher. and you know, the opposite for compassion and self-compassion. And what was really interesting is that people in higher acuity jobs like emergency rooms, urgent cares, and ICUs had higher fears of compassion. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Because you're in these high acuity jobs and lives are on the line. Not so much in urgent care, but lives are on the line. And that may, because of the training that we get, create an environment where we would be more afraid to connect, right? But what does that do to us physiologically? Well, it increases our stress. It increases our cortisol levels. And somebody's asking, what is fear of compassion? And fear of compassion is this concept, like people think compassion's soft and they don't want to be seen as weak or soft or feminine, God forbid. And so they don't think, well, they don't understand that compassion is a strength-based quality because it takes a lot of strength to show up in a compassionate way. So the fear of compassion is around that, if that makes sense. I hope that clears it up.
Yeah, I would actually like to jump in on this one because I had a similar question. And my operating frame around compassion is that there's empathy first is generated, namely, what is the other thinking? What are they feeling? And then from there, and so that's the first part. And then the second part is now I'm going to do my best to alleviate what I understand to be a source of their suffering. So I'm feeling that what they're feeling, I'm thinking, I'm understanding what they're thinking, and therefore I want to go and help them. So when you say fear of compassion, is it fear of, in my frame, at least, not to say that mine is right, but is it the fear of being empathetic, or is in connecting to begin with in that sense and trying to understand?
Sometimes.
Or is it the fear of going even further and trying to be helpful?
All of it, because sometimes people are afraid if I do this, I'm going to get burnt out, or if I do this, I'm going to get sucked into their drama, and they're afraid of that. So there are multiple levels of fears of compassion. Dr. Gilbert did a great questionnaire on fears of compassion, and it goes through different types, and it's really an interesting take a look at that, the Fears of Compassion scale by Dr. Gilbert. And it'll really clarify it, because I mean, you'll see parts of yourself in it. You'll be like, wow, yeah, you know, I have a little bit of fear in this aspect. And so it's really an interesting concept. And then that fear, what does that do in a human body? Well, that brings up your sympathetic nervous system. It dysregulates you, and you can't do much from a dysregulated state. And what I mean by dysregulated is out of balance, because your body is constantly trying to put you back in balance, homeostasis, right? But with compassion, what's really cool is compassion, and I say this, is a full-bodied experience, because it affects your immune system by elevating interleukin-6, which is an interleukin part of your immune system that helps you fight disease and inflammation. It helps regulate C-reactive protein, which is a biomarker we use a lot for inflammatory processes. Even your saliva, your salivary amylase and cortisols, they are affected by compassion and lowered by compassion. And then you move into your heart, and, you know, your vascular system, and your blood pressure is lower, and your, you know, heart rate variability is more variable, not too variable, because that's not good, but it's just the right amount of variable, and it gets you into that nice, healthy level of variability. And you think about your nervous system and how your vagus nerve is kind of lit up, for lack of a better term. And what happens is that you can get regulated. You can have that balance in your system. And that vagus nerve, my favorite nerve of the body, innervates almost every organ in your body. So it's regulating your entire system. And there's 98 different areas of your brain that light up in a state of compassion. And so, I mean, this compassion we're talking about is truly an embodied experience. It's from head to toe, and it's undeniable, and it's quite beautiful.
Do,
And
do you happen to know, because you were just kind of going through all these different amazing
yeah,
elements. It'd be curious to see if there's a chart or something that's, the embodiment of compassion and just
oh my gosh, I need to
looking.
make that chart.
Yeah, I was just about to say, can I give you an invitation to do that? And maybe we can present
I
that.
will do that. I
Cool.
can't
Let's present
wait.
that at one of the conferences, in the fall.
Oh my gosh, I would love.
Wouldn't that be cool?
Yes.
Just seriously, like an outline and
Yes.
just the heart
What a
rate and
great
all of the vagus
idea.
nerves and just being able to identify, here's the tangible,
Oh
scientifically
yeah.
backed thing. I think that'd be a very
Oh yeah.
powerful frame. It would also be interesting too we can take this offline, but it would be interesting too
Yeah.
to see how that shows up in people's daily lives. Like, so for instance, to your
Yes.
original point,
Oh, I
thinking
love
about
it.
this being fearful of compassion in your words in the
Right.
urgent cares, in these various emergencies and so forth.
Right. What that
I imagine that the constant shutting down of that connectivity, that desire to do that, has the body then respond against itself. So that those people that are not engaging, I would think that would probably be a very real basis to understand where their burnout is and how that shows up. And it might be even interesting too to track that over time and look very specifically about those people in those states. Anyway, apologies. We can talk about that offline, but
love it.
I think that'd be pretty cool. So,
Yeah. Agreed. Super
Tom?
cool.
Just to jump in. So I'm seeing in the chat, people are saying, please don't take that offline. The excitement, the energy,
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
please, if there's anything more, please continue to share it with the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. No question. It would be we wouldn't do this and then just kind of like keep it to ourselves. The concept would be to, put it out there. Yeah, exactly. Don't tell anyone, because that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to quell compassion and put it back under the rock. No, absolutely. We would, we'll talk about the mechanics of generating this offline.
Yeah.
But we'll put it on websites and we can make it available for people, of course. And maybe you could come back if we're invited back to Humanity Rising and we could talk about it. I think that'd be pretty cool. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to jump into, because hearing you react to Catherine to compassion, it came up in yesterday's broadcast with Dr. Michael Nagler, talking about the two hands of nonviolence, that people hold nonviolence as it's this thing where you're just a wimp, and it's you don't have any power or strength. And what I was hearing and what you were saying about compassion, it's the same problem that we have as a society, that we don't see the two hands of compassion, that there is real power, there is real strength, and there's also that human connection.
Right. I mean, you have to be strong to really take a good look at yourself and say, this is where I'm blocked and I'm going to do something about it. And it takes a very strong person to be compassionate in extraordinary circumstances. If you think about it, if somebody is, truly suffering with something like, drug addiction or something, very big, and to just, be present with their suffering in a way that doesn't interfere with it, because sometimes people need to suffer, and to be able to alleviate their long-term suffering by sitting with their short-term suffering is, I mean, for me, that's where I struggle the most, because I just want to get in there and fix the problem because, hey, I probably can, right? This is what we think, right? But we can't really, but we think we can. And so those acts, and then just the small acts of, allowing, like if you're a parent, allowing your child to mess up because they have to in order to learn, that's an act of compassion. It takes strength to hold back in that moment, because if they didn't tighten up the bolt on the wheel, I mean, that's dangerous, but but if they didn't tighten up the bolt on the wheel and they get on and ride the bike, the wheel's going to fall off, but sometimes the wheel has to fall off, the metaphoric wheel, in order for them to really become fully human. And So it's strength-based for sure.
You
Yeah.
know, there was a comment in the chat that's timely for me, and I'd like to speak to
Oh,
it.
great.
It says fear of compassionate connection is indeed a symptom of our Western illness. Agreed. Why do we tend to look at scientific proof instead of our own hearts? It's a deep question. And I think it ties to, first off, thank you for that, Kim. That is a great statement.
It
I think
is.
what we're seeing, particularly is compassion as strength. I was talking to Shivani Modi and Ankur Jain of Seeker, who was on this program before, and they've done a fair amount of work at looking at the Vedantic and yogic texts and understanding some of the statements, and they've been translating them into a system for people based on asking people their questions about how they're sleeping, their exercise, their energy levels, and through that understanding the biorhythms of a given person at a given moment in time, which changes, and then as a result prescribing yogic practices, in this case asana, pranayama, yoga nidra practices to help that person get back into balance. And I think a lot of what we were just talking about with the heart rate variability and the thing that we're going to do together around the embodiment of compassion, I think what's fascinating is that it's not that scientific proof is needed to demonstrate that these things are real, because our intuitive understanding is such that we've been passing this information down for thousands of years, many hundreds of generations. And humans are ultimately very, very practical. They're not going to pass something down over time that in some ways isn't useful. That's always been my assumption. And so when we think about compassion, or we think about the example that I was just speaking to around Seeker, I think what becomes interesting is that there is spiritual wisdom and spiritual understanding, and I don't want to use the word knowledge, but embodiment, just deep understanding that is the practices are ultimately pointing back to managing our neurobiological, psychophysiological embodied states through principles of statement. And intuitively, I think people seem to understand that because it feels right, literally feels right. But what now we have is MRI machines and various ways of measuring things in a scientific frame. And that, unfortunately, is the language, that's the new common language by which there is some level of shared belief or shared agreement on what something is or is not true, for lack of a better frame. So it feels to me like the project that what you're speaking to and the strength that comes from being compassionate is really to scientifically at one level understand what we've intuitively known. Namely, we're externalizing and understanding how the neurobiology and or how does oxytocin work? How does serotonin work? How does it show up here in this pattern? And how does the HRV change and so forth? Anyway, I just kind of a flash, wanted to speak to Kim's statement in the chat. Curious from both of you how, if my craziness is landing and that's somewhat making sense.
Not crazy. Well, I would like to speak to that too, because here's the thing, is that there are some of us human beings who intuitively know things and are in touch with it enough to know that it is true, capital T, true, right? And then there are other human beings who are like, yeah, that might be true. It sounds good, but do we have some proof for that? Because I'm only getting a lowercase t on this truth. And so what happens when we bring the science into this is that we are now in a position to include everyone, those who see the little t truth and those who see the capital T truth. And I think that the science about it brings us closer together in that way, because there are people whose brains work in a very linear fashion, and that is how they were born, and there is nothing wrong with that. And then there are folks whose brains work a little bit more in the winding road with intuition, and that is just as valid and true. Bringing us together like this is really amazing, and I think that's why the science is important, is because it unifies us in a way that and I know because I have a really good friend who's known this her whole life, And she's just like, Catherine, you're just studying everything I've been telling you. And I'm like, yes, Jeannie, I am. I am. And thank you for knowing it before me, because if it weren't for her intuitive knowing and her capital T truth, I never would have gotten here.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I think there's so many roads and frames to arrive at I appreciate the capital T versus small t truth. I tend not to I get a little cautious for myself because anyway, just because of that framing, I agree with it. And it's interesting that there's the intuitive ways, there's the rational ways, there's knowing in different flavors depending on who it is that we're speaking to. Or I should say, excuse me, how an individual is approaching it. Like you were just talking about your friend Jeannie versus your own understanding. And it also feels too like the scientific, how to say validation, how to say this. There are truths out there that we know and feel that are not yet scientifically validated. And of course, maybe at some point our scientific capabilities might catch up with that at some point, but it doesn't make them any less true by any means, of course. But when it comes to these kinds of things, particularly around compassion, particularly around how it's been thought of in a patriarchal frame as weak and, and something that's not desirable, or you do kind of later, just kind of flipping this and saying, no, it actually requires great strength to be able to come forward and to be compassionate, not just for another, but mostly for oneself. Extraordinary amounts of strength to do that. And I think that the scientific framing of it, in the sense of the physiological benefits that are demonstrated now that we're starting to understand from a scientific basis, gives to what Stan has been mentioning earlier in our pre-chats around the permission or the invitation to, if you intuitively start to understand, but yet you're, somehow being skeptical of your own understanding, the science allows that opportunity and that permission to, I think, embrace what one already knows intuitively.
And it allows us to bring it to a system who needs that validation.
Precisely.
In order to change their methods of engaging.
Exactly.
And it gives you a little bicep, little power to come in with,
Yeah. That's what we're doing with the ROI of care stuff around Compassion 2.0, is to be able to translate that into the financial benefits so that the gatekeepers can say, oh, here's a logical stream as to why it makes sense to promote trust and safety and put on lo-fi beats and have people bring in flowers and change the lighting, because we know that we're going to get better outcomes. And as a result of that, we're going to make more money, and not by any means that's the end goal, because it's not. But in terms of the Trojan horse, to get it inside organizations today, that's the short-term language and understanding that's needed to achieve that.
That's the practical
right
way. I mean, for it to get in there, you have to have, like you said, the Trojan horse. I love that. I love that metaphor.
Well, Tom, we're coming to the end. I want to toss this back to you for any last minute comments or thoughts, and then I'm sure you'll next invite Jim back in to join us.
Yeah, just picking up on the thread of the conversation earlier about the need for the science. And, if we look at so much of scientific research, it's history based. There's the scientific method, and everything is built on what has happened in the past. And so that drives so much of the thinking around this. The other piece that science has done is it's equated the skull brain with the mind.
Right.
And there's no acknowledgement of consciousness. There's no acknowledgement that we are anything other than a physical body, and that there's this thing in our brain. And thank God the polyvagal research that's been done to show the connection between the skull brain, the brain around our heart, and the brain in our gut. And so we're evolving as a species to understand the complexity of who we are as humans. And I love the the research you're describing around the way the body responds to compassion, and to be able to look at the hormonal reactions, the different things that are happening in the body with compassion. And that's critical research to help us get beyond the scientific frame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think with that, we'll invite Jim back into the conversation as we wrap up today. And just a huge thank you to you, Catherine, for joining us today, and your book and the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It means the world to me.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. You're on the front line. If there's any professional group that are literally on the front line 24/7, 365, it's our nurses and medical professionals. And so I just want to applaud who you've become working as you have under institutional duress. And the question I think I would like to explore with you is the relationship between compassion, as you've come to understand it, and healing.
Mm,
Because many doctors are healers and many doctors are not healers.
right.
Some healers are not doctors. There's
Right.
something about the healing phenomenon that is deeply mysterious and has to do with the being of the person who is doing the healing.
Right.
And so I just would just wonder what your experience has been over the years as to what you've discovered about the capacity to hold compassion and the capacity to actually heal, and whether there's any data that you've garnered in that regard.
Well, there's a couple of different ways to approach that question. And one of them is just my lived experience. When I see patients and you can almost see the healing begin. Now, the healing is something that they're going to carry with them. They're going to heal. But one of the things that I've noticed when I bring this compassion, when I create the conditions in the room with the patient for compassion to arise, for me, for the patient, and for the patient to have it for themselves. One of the most repeated things I say to patients is, the question is, do you believe that you made yourself sick? And they will say, yes, my God, if I didn't do this, if I didn't do that, if I only lost weight, if I did this, oh my gosh, and this and that, and they're the blame, 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 blame. And I said, what if the conditions in your life are such that this is what happened? Without defending it, without denying it, just what if this is just what happened? And there's no blame associated with it. What if this just happened? And their faces just kind of go blank, like they power down, like boom, 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 this does not compute. I must blame myself, and bring that self-compassion to them. Somehow, some way, this connection between the two of us occurs. You can feel it. And you can see them begin to heal. And the most common thing I hear is, well, number one, will you be my primary care doctor? And I say no, because I do urgent care. The second thing is, thank you for listening to me. Nobody listens anymore. And to me, I think, how is this possible? Because you say, hey, what's going on? And they're going to talk to you, right? And if they don't feel like they've even been heard, it takes that compassion, that open heart, in order to not just listen, but hear what they say. You know what I mean? And so I think that this quality of compassion brought into that room creates the conditions for healing to arise. So you have these conditions for compassion to arise, And then compassion creates the conditions for healing to arise. And then healing creates the conditions for, and so on and so on and so on. Did I even answer your question? Maybe.
No, very, very much so. And I'd like to just take up one of your points because I think it's worth a deeper exploration. And that is that when you say what caused this, they have all these blames. And then when you say, let's let go of that, they power down into incomprehension. It reminded me of a book that a good friend of mine, Carolyn Mace, who you may have heard about. She's a medical clairvoyant.
Oh, I love her. Yeah, yeah.
And she wrote a book on why people don't heal.
Yes, read
And
it.
her assertion is that the reason why there's so little healing is that people are literally addicted to their own wounds.
They are.
And that the miracle is not healing. The miracle is how come people won't heal
Right.
because of this blame and guilt and
Oh,
shame,
no.
which is an addictive attachment
It
to
is.
trauma.
It is.
So I would love to have your comment on that because that's an extraordinarily important aspect of the current malaise in the culture is the
Well,
addiction to the trauma itself.
here it is. We all seek love. We all seek to be seen. We all seek to be heard. And we will get it by any means possible. And we will get it even in like a drop of water in the desert is still better than no drop of water. And when you have an illness, right, you will get some attention. You will get some visibility. You will get some drops of water along the way from the time you walk into the care center to you see the clinician, to you go to the pharmacy, to, you know what I'm saying? So there is this possibility for getting some of our basic human needs met that aren't getting met otherwise in this system through illness. And that's a whole other, I mean, that's like this aspect of it. And sometimes even negative attention is better than none. Sometimes not being validated is just as effective as validating when it comes to unhealthy attachments. I mean, this is getting kind of deep, but it is still part of the truth. And so dismantling that is something as a collective we need to start looking at as well. Like I always tell my patients, they say, well, I'm a diabetic. I'm like, no, no, you're not. What you are is a human being whose body is displaying symptoms of the inability for glucose to get into the cell based on a couple of different things going on in your body right now. You are not diabetic. Your body's displaying these symptoms. Can you please stop using this language with me? And they're like, what? Wait, how can you not call me? But I'm taking all these medicines. I'm like, yes, your body is utilizing these medications to get sugar into the cells. And that's it. That's the whole point. Some of them, make the cells more sensitive. Some of them, I mean, it's owning the diseases, in my opinion, is a really big mistake. And but it's a mistake that I meet with compassion because they've been told this over and over again by these people who go to school and study it and study it and study it. And, so they must be right. The experts are telling them, right? And so that's where I get a little bit, like, and, and people say, oh, I'm anxious. And I'm like, you just might be paying attention, but let's just not own this so much. Your
Mm.
body is displaying a hyper aroused sense because there's a lot of on. And you don't really know quite what to do with it yet. But when you figure out what to do with everything that you think is causing anxiety, your anxious levels will go down. I mean, I'm putting like hyperthyroidism and, you know, tumors on your adrenals aside. You're going to feel anxious until those things resolve. But in general, when people say, "Oh, I have anxiety," or "I have depression," I'm like, "Yeah, you have these symptoms that we classify as those things, but you are not depressed. You are not anxiety. You are so much more than this."
Mm.
And
Beautiful.
let's start remembering those glorious, strong, grounded pieces of who you are, so that those pieces of you can help these other pieces, these dysregulated aspects of you, to come back to your true nature. And I mean, it's hard work. That's why this stuff is for strong. It's not light work here. It's definitely something that I would like to see more of happening in the medical community. But again, I have a master's in public health, and I always think, how did we go from everybody having ashtrays in their houses to nobody having ashtrays in their houses, right? And smoking in, the smoking section of a restaurant. Do you guys remember that? We're like, this place, but there's no barrier between, there's smoke everywhere. But how did we get from that to nobody smoking? Small incremental changes over time. It didn't happen overnight. In fact, it happened so insidiously that one day I thought, wow, nobody's smoking in here. Trippy. Like, when did that happen? And then, so it's these small incremental changes. Everything that every single one of us does matters. Every single step towards compassion matters. So no, there's no compassionate action that is too small. Do it. The time is now. It's critical.
Yeah, that fierce urgency of now. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I wish you could replicate yourself around the world, Catherine
Oh, that's a
Schweikert.
really sweet thing to say. Thank you. Thank you
We
so
need
much.
more of you out there.
Well, there are more of me out there, more than you know. It's just we're just finally starting to speak up. Our fear of being squashed is lessening.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you.
There's a
Bless
lot of
you.
us. Mhm.
So, Carson, Tom, do you want to tee us up for tomorrow?
Sure, I can take that one. Tomorrow we're going to have Scott Snibbe join us. He is, how to say, he's an internationally recognized multimedia artist. He's a three-time venture capital backed founder, and most importantly, a deep, deep practitioner and teacher of various forms of Tibetan Buddhism. And he has written a book called How to Train a Happy Mind, which is on analytical meditation. And basically, my words, not his, secularizes some of those practices to bring them to a wider audience on how to orient ourselves in the world in a very practical frame that is alleviating self-suffering and generating compassion. He's fabulous. He's an amazing individual. So very excited about it tomorrow.
Cool. Thank you. Any closing comments, Tom?
Just a huge thank you again, Catherine, for being with us today, and your work and your book, and multiplying who you are and what you're doing out in the world, so that we all can benefit, and the world can shift. And that, the metaphor that you used about smoking is a great one, or stopping smoking is a great one. So thank you again for being with us today. And Carson, Jim, as always, thank you both for another terrific program.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Carson. Thank you, Catherine. You've been an inspiration for all of us today, so we appreciate it. And that'll bring us to a close, everyone. You'll find the link to the after chat. Those of you who are interested in the chat box, you received it in your Zoom reminder. And then we'll see you all tomorrow for session 4 of our 5-day program on Compassion 2.0. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you
Bye.
all.
Thank you.